morning and welcome to another guest lecture of the Dorothy Marie Lowry Distinguished Guest Lecture Series. And today we have someone who is I'm very excited. He is joining us from the University of Notre Dame. And we will be hearing from Dr. Patrick Griffin. Unfortunately, he was called away at the last moment, but he was able to do a lecture recording for us for this morning. So Dr. Griffin's research explores the intersection of colonial American and early modern Irish and British history, focusing on Atlantic-wide themes and dynamics. He has published work on the movement of peoples and cultures across the Atlantic Ocean, as well as the process of adaptation. He also examines the ways in which Ireland, Britain, and America were linked during the 17th and 18th centuries. He has studied revolution and rebellion, movement and migration, and colonization and violence in each society in comparative perspective. Griffin, who holds a PhD from Northwestern University, is the author of several books, including The Townshend Moment, The Making of Empire and Revolution in the 18th Century, published by Yale University Press. And it's about a chronicle of two British brothers who help incite revolution in America and insurgency and reform in Ireland. And also, he has written, The People with No Name, Ireland's Ulster Scots, America's Scots-Irish, and the Creation of a British Atlantic World, published by Princeton University Press. He is an editor of Experiencing Empire, Power, People, and Revolution in Early America, published by the University of Virginia Press. Dr. Griffin was selected as an honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy in 2022, and he was elected to the American Aquatarian Academy in 2021. He has received grants and fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Huntington Library, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Filson Historical Society. He joined the Notre Dame faculty in 2008 and served as chair of the History Department from 2011 to 2017. And he has also received the James A. Burns Graduate School Award for his numerous contributions to graduate studies. So, my friends, get ready to explore some global history presented by Dr. Patrick Griffin.
Hi, my name is Patrick Griffin. I teach history at the University of Notre Dame. I also direct the Colonial Institute for Irish Studies, and I'm delighted to be with you here today to discuss some of my work. Up to this point in my career, I've been working a lot on what we call Atlantic history. And you see on the screen, you'll notice the Atlantic Ocean. The work that I do, for the most part, ties the places on the Old World, on the eastern side of the Atlantic, to those places on the western side of the Atlantic, like, for example, where the United States is. And so my work generally looks at kind of processes that bound these places together, broader dynamics, how the system was somehow integrated, and also how people, particularly those on the margins, have tried to manage this kind of dynamic space that was being transformed before the American Revolution and after the American Revolution. And that's more or less what I've cut my teeth on. I'm working on something new and actually more expansive than that right now. I've branched out into global history. And I'm delighted to be here today to give you a glimpse of some of the work that I'm doing, because it does global history in a different kind of way. You see on the left-hand side, there's a picture of a gentleman. His name is James Yankee Sullivan. I've been fascinated with this guy, fixated about tracking him around the world. And his story about his travels and his experiences, his adventures, is one that allows us, I think, to imagine global history in a very new and interesting sort of way. As I'm going to argue today, Sullivan, who was a prize fighter, was one of the people who made our world. We're going to follow him from where he was born to where he and his family would live for some period of time, to where he would be moved. As we'll see, he would be moved to a certain place on the other side of the earth, where he would escape from and make his way to the United States. And from thence, he'd make his way back to the Pacific Ocean, but in a very different kind of place than he was before. His journeys take us literally across this map. As a matter of fact, as we're going to see, he was probably one of the first non-sailors who happened to be a common man who circumnavigated the globe. We're also going to see something else about, I think, important about the nature of our world today. Sullivan is not a great guy like a founding father. He's not one of these people who came up with new visions of political economy about how this whole you see before you was supposed to function, how it was supposed to work. He was a common man. That's indeed what he was. But he was a common man who would have a hand in making this map that we see. As we're going to find out, he and other prize fighters were very often the first people to come to the most dynamic places on planet Earth. They would tend to come to places that were connected to other connection nodes on the planet. And he would move from one to the other in a very brief window of time when these places, as I will explain, were becoming, when they were being transformed, usually from more marginal kinds of seaports into global connection points. And he and common people like him were the people that were world creators. And as I said before, it was going to be prize fighters of all people, those who were most adaptable, those who could improvise the best, those who were indeed the toughest, were very often the first people to go to these places that were becoming. So that's a story I'd like to share with you today. This is an elusive character we're going to discover, but an absolutely fascinating one, whose story I think deserves to be told, not only in its own right, but what it says about the world that we happen to inhabit today. So without further ado, let's get on to the story of James Yankee Sullivan. Okay, here's where we run into a problem right away. Here he is, as they would say in the old days, in fighting attitude. This is kind of a pose that many fighters would strike. His name was not James Yankee Sullivan when he was born, and this was one of the more difficult things about trying to deal with a character like him. He went by many different aliases throughout his life, as we'll see, with good reason. However, it took me a long period of time to track down, indeed, what his birth name was. Through lots of kind of mistakes, through lots of trial and error, through lots of going into dead ends and cul-de-sacs, I discovered that his name, when he was born, was actually Francis Ambrose. Francis Ambrose was born in 1813, okay? And he happened to be born on this island of Ireland. Now, we're looking at a map from about the year 1800 or so, just some years before he was born. But the place that he was born in was someplace that was down in the extreme southwest. So if you look down at the bottom of your map to County Cork, on the western part of County Cork, a real marginal kind of area was where he was born. And the town he was born in was called Bandon. Bandon. Bandon exists today. It's a beautiful little market town. Here we are, some pictures of what it looks like today. But at the time, it was very different. You see, Francis Ambrose was born a Catholic, but he was born in a Catholic in an area that was dominated by Protestants. And Bandon was a Protestant town. It's one of the last walled cities that actually is constructed in Ireland. It's built in the wake of the Reformation. And Protestants built it as kind of a citadel in a sea of swarming Catholics around them. Indeed, Catholics were not admitted into the town for some period of time. And Ambrose and his family happened to live just outside of those walls, probably in a place that's known today as Irish Town. In other words, where Irish people, Irish speakers, Catholics would live in the shadow of this town, where, as the saying went, even the pigs were Protestant. But Bandon, even if it kind of started as a Reformation experiment for Protestantism, was a place that was dynamically changing at the beginning of the 19th century. On the right-hand side, you see an image of what we call the quays. These were constructed at this time by the town fathers in order to link this town Bandon into a broader trading world. All of Ireland was being now tied into a British-mediated Atlantic world of trade. Places like Cork were sending goods and sending produce out to places like the Caribbean. And the people in Bandon wanted to get in on this, as all the world now was kind of being transformed by increased trade. People who were kind of running Bandon thought it was time to get Bandon into that business as well. And these keys were built just before the time that he happened to be born. But there was other things that were happening in Bandon as well. With this, the walls of Bandon began to come down, and for the first time, Catholics were admitted into the town. They were admitted into the town because the town needed increased labor with all of the things that it hoped to accomplish by tying it into a broader world. But with these kinds of changes also came grave difficulties. Bandon was a town of sectarian bigotry. Protestants hated Catholics. Catholics also came to hate Protestants. And in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, right at the time when Francis Ambrose was born, this town experienced a terrible recession. Indeed, all places throughout the broader British world were experiencing recession. It's what normally happens after periods of warfare. Economies contract, and this is hitting Bandon, and it was hitting it hard. Okay. With this anyway, and because of the old historic enmities between Protestants and Catholics anyway, tensions began to erupt into violence. So what we see here is an image of an Irish Catholic character known as Captain Rock. He was a mythic figure, but a lot of people calling themselves Rockites would go in, they would kind of, if you will, try to intimidate Catholics who were trying to intimidate Protestants who were intimidating Catholics. And what you find is this period of tremendous rural insurgency and urban insurgency in places like Bandon. Protestants were killing Catholics and Catholics were killing Protestants. So the Ambroses were more or less kind of outsiders in this broader world. And they were outsiders in this broader world just as tensions between these two historic groups were beginning to erupt once more in Ireland. It was almost like the Reformation all over again. We also find at this time from Bandon, there was a massive movement of men and women out of the town with the economic recession and with the rising sectarian tensions. Very few people from this area at this particular point in time anyway would head to America. There are certain other sections of Ireland where the people would head over to the United States, but not so much from here. No, there were historic connections between this place and somewhere else. And during times of stress and strain, what you would find is that the people who lived in places like Bandon would not so much head to the United States as head to a place that was much, much closer. They would usually go to places like London. Now, around London, there were whole neighborhoods that were filled with the Irish. There weren't a lot of Irish in London at the time, but there were pockets that were dominated by it. If, for example, you know anything about London today, the neighborhood that we call Covent Garden, that all tourists will inevitably head to, was an area that was dominated by Catholics, Irish Catholics who happened to live in that area. It was one of the poorest sections of all of London. It was also one of the places that was the most crime-ridden. And because of that, the Irish had a reputation of being clannish and also being criminal in the way that they kind of dealt with other Londoners at the time. But what we find at this time is this London now is beginning to grow by leaps and bounds. Covent Garden was in the West End of London. But what we find now, because of increased global trade, in particular increased trade with Asia, is that London is really starting to grow further and further to the east. Now, this eastward growth had already been taking place earlier, but now it begins to accelerate. And you find that groups that would have been attracted to London are not so much heading toward the Covent Garden area. They start going to places that are most dynamically changing. And the place that many, many Irish increasingly are going to go to, and that the Ambroses are going to head to, is a place we know today as Whitechapel. Actually, it was Whitechapel, Spitalfields, two neighborhoods on the east end of London. This is an image, actually, of the main road going through Whitechapel today. And you'll notice it still is kind of a center of migration in London. And this is what it probably looked like at the time that the Ambroses were arriving. And so they're living together here. They're living in a mixed area, a very pluralist area. This is an area, too, that's going to attract an increasing number of Jews who happen to live in the area. There's more and more Irish, and there's a lot of work for all kinds of people to do. The Irish tended to work down by the docks. The docks are only a few blocks away from this high street in Whitechapel. And we know for a fact that Ambrose's father, John Ambrose, is probably working as what we call a coal whipper down in an area called Wapping, which was right by Whitechapel. A coal whipper was simply a guy who was loading and unloading coal onto ships. Very, very difficult work that didn't require much brains, required a lot of brawn and a lot of stamina. That's what he's doing. And we think, too, that young Francis Ambrose is following in his father's footsteps, and he also is doing this kind of physical labor at the time. This was an area that is denoted by not only kind of, if you will, growing opportunity for people like the Ambroses, it also is one of those first places that's going to be defined by modern urban poverty. And so people would walk through these streets and they would just note how impoverished some of the people were. There were no social welfare nets for people at this particular period of time. They had to struggle and hold on to each other as they tried to make their lives in this very competitive, unforgiving environment. So it's a very different kind of place than the Bandon that they had left before. Bandon they had left before was still a competitive, difficult kind of place. It was a place that was defined by sectarian tension. This place is defined, if you will, by pluralism, but also by increasing urban poverty. And Whitechapel is one of those most important centers that's beginning to explode, that is becoming one of these connection points. And this happens to be the dynamic place that the Ambroses are heading to. The place was also noted for something else. It was the center of boxing talent, increasingly in England. Boxing in England was a big, big sport. It was because it was patronized by the gentry, and also it was a sport that was practiced by all of these young, tough immigrants who were coming into the city. What we see here on this cup is an image of the most famous of them all. This was a Jewish fighter right from this area of Whitechapel called Daniel Mendoza, who is known as being a guy who created, if you will, a scientific approach to boxing, someone who knew defense a great deal, someone who was a crafty kind of fighter, and someone who kind of electrified the English fighting world when he was busy plying his craft. This is the area the Ambroses come into. And what you find is these areas that, again, are tying places to the broader world are also places that are denoted by prize fighting. Prize fighting in England is something that more and more people are following. Some people say this defines the English at the time, even so much so that even those on the margins like Jews are also beginning to kind of get in on the game at the time. And this is something that defines the East End of London, Whitechapel, Spitalfields area that they come into. Another small world sort of thing is Daniel Mendoza happened to live on this famous street called Petticoat Lane. Here's an image of it right now. It was a place where people would be out there street hawking, where they would be selling goods on the street, but it was also a place that was denoted by lots of pickpockets, lots of people who were up to kind of bad or sorts of things, criminals. And it was also a place where this is where they would fence some of their goods. There was an old saying on Petticoat Lane. On one end of Petticoat Lane, you could have your petticoat stolen and you could buy it back at the other end of the lane. If you go there today, there's still an open market, no pickpockets, thankfully. But back in the day, this is where the Ambroses lived. They lived right on Petticoat Lane. And so did Daniel Mendoza. So Daniel Mendoza had retired from the ring by this time. He's actually running a tavern. He's running a school for boxing. We don't have no idea if young Francis Ambrose is going to be following Mendoza at this time, but every kid in the world knew about Daniel Mendoza. And every kid who lived on the street would have been very proud they lived on the same street. Not only did Mendoza live here, but someone else did as well. This guy by the name of Ike Solomons, who was probably regarded as the most famous thief and fence in all of early 19th century London. There was going to be a whole kind of, there was going to be a whole mythology that was going to go around Ike Solomons, so much so that when Charles Dickens writes Oliver Twist, he's going to have his character Fagin modeled after the real Ike Solomons. And Ike Solomons, or Fagin from Oliver Twist, lived on the same street that young Francis Ambrose lived on. Now, the fate of Fagin and also of the Artful Dodger was also going to be the fate of young Francis Ambrose. Many of the young people here in this area are pulled into petty crime. And I have on your left-hand side here, you'll see an image of a pub called the Artful Dodger that was on another street in Whitechapel where people would sell and fence things, a place called Rosemary Lane, where people would sell all kinds of stolen goods, and then people would buy some of these goods. Ike Solomon's or Fagin happened to work right in this area. Now, this pub had another name at the time, but today it's known as the Artful Dodger. You can go right in and you can have a pub, and you can have a pint, and you're right in the area where so much of kind of this sort of East End of London criminal life was actually taking place. Our friend, Francis Ambrose, was going to learn a great deal about this criminal life because when he's a young boy at the age of 14, he's picked up by a constable for picking somebody's pocket. What does he steal? He steals a handkerchief. He steals a handkerchief. Now, to us, that may not seem like much of anything at all, but we know from what Dickens is going to write in Oliver Twist, the Artful Dodger, the image that you see on the right-hand side, was going to be arrested also for picking a pocket. And what was going to happen to the Artful Dodger in Oliver Twist? He was going to be sent to Australia. So what was going to happen to Francis Ambrose? The same fate. He was going to be sent to Newgate Prison, one of the most notorious prisons in all the world. That wasn't too far from the house he lived in. And then he was going to be found guilty of picking this pocket. He was going to claim and tell the judge, and this is a lot of insolence right here, that he had nothing to do about it, that he was ultimately framed, and the judge was not going to take too kindly to this, and he was going to commit him for 14 years of penal servitude in Australia. This was a new experiment on the part of the British. It was a new experiment to get rid, if you will, of the excess criminal population. Prisons were bursting at the seams. And this had to do largely with the transformation of the London economy because of this global trade networking that I was talking about that gave rise to Whitechapel and Spitalfields in the first place. So he's going to be sent to Newgate, then he's going to be dispatched to Australia. He's going to be put on what's called a prison hulk. And a prison hulk is one of these floating prisons. They were usually decommissioned ships. And you see on your right-hand side, one that's going to be made famous by the painter Turner. It's going to be these decommissioned ships that the masts are taken off, and they're just going to be floating prisons for people to kind of stay in because Newgate, places like that, are bursting at the seams. And young Francis Ambrose is going to be sent to a ship called the Euryalus in a town called Chatham, down at the very end of the Thames estuary, awaiting transport to Australia. Then eventually he's going to be sent on the ship that you see at the bottom of your screen here, called the Basora Merchant, and he's going to be transported to Australia all the way down the Atlantic, around Africa, under Africa, through the Indian Ocean, then to Australia. So that's going to be his fate. The Australian exercise also wasn't just about, if you will, getting rid of kind of the refuse population, as people at the time put it. It was a way of peopling Australia, making it a new settler colony, and tying this place on the other end of the earth into a British imperial global economy. And it was hoped that convicts were going to start transforming this place from what they regarded as a wilderness into some sort of settled society that could be another important node of empire. And so young Francis is sent over, and he's sent immediately then to the town of Sydney. And Sydney, Australia is, if you will, exactly like London in many kinds of ways. It is tying regional economies into kind of global patterns of trade. And so this is tying various places in the broad Tasman Sea, that is the sea between New Zealand and Australia, into the wider imperial kind of trading patterns at the time. And so he's going to be sent here to Sydney, and he's going to be given work on what was called the assignment system. He would be assigned to some settler who happened to be there, and it was his job to try to do his little bit to start transforming this Australia into something else. He went right away to work in an area that's right above, right by the bridge you see there in Sydney, the iconic bridge, an area that was known as the Rocks. And the Rocks there just happened to be on a kind of a bunch of rocks, if you will, a rocky crag sitting right above Sydney Harbor. He's going to be working there for an Irish couple who happen to run a pub. And one of the things they're doing in this pub is they are actually feeding a group of soldiers who happen to be in their barracks right next door. And so young Francis Ambrose, when he leaves when he's 14, he arrives when he's 15 years old. His job is to just work for these people. And eventually with time, after he serves his 14 years, then he will be able to be a free person, and he can stay in Australia, and then hopefully will somehow be a credit to that society. but our young Francis soon runs afoul of the law. And here we have an image at the time of prisoners who had committed another crime while they were in prison. They would be then part of what was called a jail gang, and they'd be doing other kinds of physical labor, often in chains, around the town. And I want you to kind of take a look at that. On the right-hand side there, you see a building. It still stands in Sydney today. Here is that building. It's called Hyde Park Barracks. And today it's an amazing museum to the prison system in Australia. But this is a place where young Francis Ambrose is sent after he steals something while he's working for that Irish couple up in the Rocks area. And this is going to be a place of awful torment and of torture and of awful kinds of discipline for many of these convicts who run afoul of the law. And this is going to be his fate. We see on our left-hand side the kind of room these people would have slept in at the time. And you can only imagine, he's 15 years old. He's one of the younger people that is here. If you want someone to be toughened up, this is probably the place to do it. He doesn't spend much time here. By the way, he'll have more and more run-ins and sent to this place a number of times. So he's going to know Hyde Park Barracks very, very well with his time in Australia. Well, after this, he's sentenced then down to go to the prison colony of this penal colony called Australia, a place that was known as Moreton Bay. Moreton Bay was regarded as a hell on earth. It was a place where people who were sentenced to secondary crimes in Australia had to serve usually about a period of 3 years for their crimes, and they had to do hard manual labor in chains day and night. And unfortunately, when Francis Ambrose gets to this awful, awful place, it's run by a commandant known as Patrick Logan, who is known as a sadistic sort of character, who would torture the people torture the men at all times, who is known for his draconian discipline, so much so that people would try to run away from here. And very often they would be returned by Aboriginal trackers. And so many of these convicts, anyway, come to hate the Aborigines because they see them as kind of working with people like Patrick Logan. And this is going to be his fate for a number of years, for 3 whole years. He's going to be living here in this terrible, terrible place. And when he's there, he's one of the youngest convicts. So you can well imagine, again, what his life is like. I don't have to relate it to you. Being around a whole bunch of men, many of them criminals at the time, he happens to be quite young. He had to be toughened up here very, very quickly. Actually, Moreton Bay now is the very pleasant city of Brisbane, Australia, where they're going to be having the Olympics. I think the next Olympics after the Paris Olympics are going to hold in Brisbane. And what you see, the building on the left-hand side is one of the few things that remains, that Francis Ambrose would have been in and out of this warehouse at the time, bringing in goods, taking out goods, doing all kinds of menial labor. This would have been a place that they would have known well. But this was an isolated outpost, kind of more or less in the middle of nowhere at the time, a place of no hope. And speaking of no hope, another one of the few things in Brisbane that remains from this convict period is this little windmill that was here. We don't see, if you will, the standard sort of windmill look to it, but the structure is clearly one of a windmill. Only next to it, there was another enclosure that doesn't exist today. And this would have been where actually people would have been, it would have been a walking mill or a climbing mill. And so those convicts who were criminals, again, if they had tried to run away or if they had gotten in trouble with authorities, they would have been put to work on this. In those days when the wind wasn't actually turning the mill and making it work, people would have done this with their own human power by kind of doing, it's almost like a stairmaster from hell. It would be step after step after step after step. They'd be doing it for 14 hours in chains. You could well imagine, anyway, what kind of shape some of these people were in. And so this is going to be his lot in life for about 3 years. He's going to spend it here at this place called Moreton Bay. After he finishes out his sentence, he's then going to head out back to Australia. And this is where we know for a fact that he's going to actually start prize fighting. The first records we have of him, and he's fighting under the nom de plume of the sobriquet is Ginger. He's known as Ginger, so he had reddish hair at the time. He was about 5'9", 5'10", something we call like a middleweight today was more or less his side. He's going to start prize fighting. And prize fighting in Australia is exclusively a convict kind of pastime at the time. There's lots of money that is gambled, but in these places, kind of where life is not taken, where life is pretty cheap, In these kinds of places, prize fighting becomes for many people a way of life, and he becomes quite good at it. And he's known right away as someone who, like Daniel Mendoza, happened to be a pretty good scientific fighter. But as he's doing this also, he's getting arrested. Prize fighting is illegal. Also, the other things he's involved in, such as beating up a constable. These are going to get him in more trouble. And for that, he's going to be sent to another place in Australia. He's going to be sent to a place that's known as the Blue Mountains. The Blue Mountains west of Sydney, okay, were this desolate kind of area, but it was an area that was tying Sydney in to the continent of Australia. And many of these convicts are going to be sent there particularly to build roads. And he's going to be on road crews doing the difficult job of breaking rock, carrying rock, building roads that can tie the continent into Australia. So convicts like him are doing this work of connecting places like Sydney, already connected to the rest of the world, to the interior of a continent. This is the physical work that they're doing, and this is the work that Francis Ambrose is going to do. Well, this is awful work. And so his time in Australia, and he was going to spend about 12 years in Australia, was nothing of difficulty, hardship, toughening up, but also the beginning of his prize fighting career. And we know for a fact that he was good because people are writing about it. And you even have some of the police officers, some of the military who were there are also patronizing prize fighting, because prize fighting is also involved in gambling and in all kinds of money making. And so Francis Ambrose becomes a little bit of a celebrity, even if he's doing some of the most miserable jobs in the world. Well, he's trying his best to figure a way of getting out of here. He tried to run away a number of times, but he's finally going to be able to do so in about the year 1840. He's going to be able to do so by getting on a whaling ship. Whaling ships came and went from Sydney, in British whaling ships, but also American whaling ships. And American whalers did not care at all if they carried away convicts. They just needed hands that were very able to do the work. They were always looking for more and more able-bodied seamen who would do the kind of the difficult work of working on a whaling ship. And whalers were those kinds of ships that made the world literally go round. As with industrial growth, before you have petroleum, it's actually whale oil is going to be lubricating machines. So much of lighting is going to be done by whale oil, okay? And so it's needed desperately throughout the world as the world is beginning to develop. And this makes it kind of a high point of whaling throughout the world at this period of time. And many of them are coming into Sydney. He jumps on board one of these ships in Sydney, and that ship is heading over to a place on the northern island of New Zealand. Place that you see here in this image, place that's known as the Bay of Islands. The Bay of Islands was another one of these places that was like a hellhole of the earth. Charles Darwin in the Beagle had just visited this place a few years before, and he said, you can't imagine what this place is like. It was a place that was dominated by convicts and these whalemen who had jumped ship, and lots of native women. So there was booze, there was sex, there was fighting. There was all kinds of difficulties that this Bay of Islands was known for. And this is the place where Francis Ambrose rocks up after he escapes from Australia. So he's here, and he's here during a summer where there's, if you will, a bumper crop of ships that happen to be in this bay. Why so many ships? Well, the Bay of Islands had become an important stopover point for many of these whaling ships that are going further and further afield to try to find sperm and right whales. And more American ships are coming into here, places from Nantucket, New Bedford, and Sag Harbor, starting to send over ships here. This is where they'll take on water, where they'll take on goods, and they'll take on pork, they'll take on fruit, they'll take on water. Okay, but oftentimes they come here and the men would just run away. And there was one ship that happened to be in the bay, and the captain there is really struggling because almost all of his men have run off, and he's desperate for any sort of person to come on and just work the ship. This is the ship that young Francis Ambrose finds, and this is the one he kind of signs up to work on. Okay, and here is the ship that here's the log of that ship that was known as the Hamilton, that's captained by a fellow by the name of David Hand. And this is his logbook. So there's nothing about the point of kind of signing on this guy, Francis Ambrose. They didn't kind of take down the names, but we know that this was a very unhappy ship. They hadn't been able to fill their hold with all the whale oil they wanted. And as they're kind of making their way back, hunting for more whales, they're not going to find any. But what they are going to find is a lot of storms, and it's going to be a very, very difficult. It's going to be a difficult trip back from New Zealand all the way up to Sag Harbor in New York, in Long Island, the end of Long Island, where the ship had come from. And this is the ship that Francis Ambrose is going to be working on. And no doubt he was working the pumps, because that's all David Hand talked about. He said the men were working the pumps. The ship was leaking. It was stormy. And so the men worked the pumps night and day. So that's the sort of work that he's doing. It would end up here at this place called Sag Harbor on the outer edge of Long Island today, a very, very famous kind of place to go where the rich and the famous rub shoulders with each other. But here at the time, this was a hard-working whaling center. Again, one of these connection points that's tying this one particular place to the rest of the wider world, coming in with a product that was necessary for global industrial development. We know, so as an interesting aside too, I can tell you that whalers themselves had a great interest in actually prize fighters. This is something I ran across at the Massachusetts Historical Society. It's a walrus tusk. It's what we call a piece of scrimshaw. So this is something that a sailor had carved, all these elaborate carvings on these kinds of things to while away his time while he was bored on the ship. And you'll notice on the bottom there, on the left-hand side, there's a prize fighter there, and it says Sullivan underneath it. This is someone who also saw Yankee Sullivan, as he's going to be known with time, as being an important character, an important person that was someone that he could actually regard as a hero at the time. And indeed, Yankee Sullivan himself was someone then who worked on a whaler. So he gets to Sag Harbor, and from Sag Harbor, then he goes right down to New York City, which is not very far away. And he's going to spend only a few months in New York at first. He'll return again in just a moment, as we see. But something very important is going to happen when he happens to be on the streets of New York. He's going to take on a new name. He's going to no longer be called Francis Ambrose. This is the name of a runaway. He's going to take on the name of James Yankee Sullivan. Now, there's all kinds of different ideas about why he takes the Sullivan name. Okay, none that I really necessarily need to get into here today. But the name Sullivan is a pretty common name in the Bandon area that he came from. It's more or less kind of like Smith in the United States. Sullivan is that kind of name when it comes to the area of Cork that he happened to come from. So let's say it has something to do with that. A common name, indeed, in so many places throughout this world where there are lots of people from West Cork anyway, a Sullivan wouldn't have been something all that unusual. But the interesting thing to me is Yankee. Yankee, why does he take it? Well, a Yankee, of course, represents an American, right? And so if you wanted to say that you were not just kind of a runaway from Australia, but you happen to be an American, the name Yankee would be helpful in that regard. But there's another reason why. In New York City at this time, in the working class areas of New York, right by the iconic area called the Five Points, right by that particular point, that particular place that more and more Irish are beginning to stream into, there were all these little theaters. And in these theaters, the most iconic figure was known as the Yankee. And the Yankee was this kind of like anti-authoritarian guy with a chip on his shoulder who hated the British and who hated authority and who hated kind of imperial ways of doing things. And so by taking on the name Yankee, he's saying something very much about kind of how he wants to style and fashion himself. It was a fashionable young man about town, but someone who was tough, someone he didn't want to mix with, but someone also who's anti-authoritarian to his core. And indeed, this more or less fits Francis Ambrose. So from Australia, by the time he eventually gets to New York, Francis Ambrose, if you will, died. And in his place is born James Yankee Sullivan. He doesn't stay in New York long, though. He gets on a ship, and this place now is tied to the rest of the world as never before. He gets on a ship, and of all things, he goes back to England. He's not going to London, where he's from. He's going back to the city of Liverpool. Liverpool is one of the most connected places in all the world, and it connects New York particularly to the rest of the world. There were more ships coming and going from New York and Liverpool probably than any major two places throughout all the world in this day. Liverpool was the important port for all of American goods. And so those goods that are produced by slave hands, particularly in the South, are being sent up to Liverpool. This is going to be the most important place where American cotton is going to go. Then it will be sent on railroads over to Manchester, where in this industrial town, the looms are going to start creating, if you will, cotton cloth and cotton fabric. This is Liverpool's role. It's a connection point in the wider world. And new dock systems are going in left and right because more and more ships are looking to tie themselves in through the Atlantic into England at the time. So he sails right to Liverpool. And here's a view of Liverpool today. He probably arrived in the left-hand side of what we call the Waterloo Docks. The building that you see there wasn't there at the time, but the docks were. And this is where most of the New York ships came into, right into the water there. On the right-hand side, there's a new system of docks that were being built exactly at this moment called the Clarence Docks. And these were the docks that most of the Irish came into who eventually were going to head to the United States. This one on the right is the most important connection point for Ireland. The one on the left is the most important connection point for Liverpool. Now, if you happen to be of Irish stock and say if one of your ancestors happened to come at the time of the Great Famine, chances are, well, it's almost 100% that they came right through those gates on the right-hand side of the Clarence Docks. In fact, all of JFK's great-grandparents, all 8 of them, actually came through there, and they went down the street then to find their way to ships that were going to head over to the New World. Yankee Sullivan's not going to head to Ireland at this particular point in time. No, he's coming here to London for a very different reason. London was an important center of boxing. It was an area, too, where many of the fighters happened to be Irish. We see the most famous one here, Jack Langan. There were also 2 brothers, the Ward brothers also, who more or less had gotten word of this kind of young fellow who had fought in Australia. They were told that this guy had some abilities, and he was right over to Liverpool to work with these 2 brothers who were kind of on the very, very cutting edge of boxing skill and boxing science. Jack Langan, by the way, is going to be a guy who's going to own a pub right outside the Clarence Street docks. He's also going to be one of the founders of what's known as St. Patrick's Chapel at the time, now St. Patrick's Church. We see it here on the right. That still stands in Liverpool today. Well, I don't think our friend Yankee Sullivan was spending too much time in church, that's for sure. But he certainly is living and spending time in the Irish section, working with Irish Liverpudlian boxers to learn the finer points. And they quickly see that he has some abilities. And what they do is they set him up immediately with a big fight. The big fight is going to take place at this place in the middle of nowhere in England called Crookham Common. And he's going to take on a bruiser by the name of Hammer Lane. You see him here on the left-hand side getting tumbled by the great American fighter, Tom Molyneux. And now I can spend another lecture talking about Tom Molyneux, one of the great figures, African-American fighter who's going to be a great fighter over in England at the time. Hammer Lane's only loss at this point had come at the hands of Molyneux. And he now is going to take on this James Yankee Sullivan in a fight in 1841. Now, he's going to play up, our friend is going to play up the name Yankee Sullivan because what he's going to do is he's going to come out with stars and stripes around his shoulders, claiming to be an American. And they say, who is this upstart American? We've never heard of him. But now this is, if you will, almost kind of becomes for him something by which he wants to style himself. It becomes for him an identity that he can hold on to. By claiming to be an American, even though he'd only spent a few months in the United States, he wants to claim the mantle of what all Americans are. They're democratic, they're anti-authoritarian, they are anti-British. This more or less defines him to the core. This is the way he's going to fight. And in this fight against Hammer Lane, he's going to take out Hammer Lane by breaking his arm. Now, I should say a few things about the rules of boxing at this particular point in time. They're not like our rules today, where you have matches that go, or that you have rounds that go for 3 minutes and you sit down for a minute, then you'll get back up again and fight for another 3 minutes. And the fight ends when someone is knocked out or you've come to the end of the prescribed rounds and then judges render a verdict. Those are what we call largely the Marquis of Queensberry rules. Those are the rules that dominate boxing today. No, in this day, boxing in a prize fight was done with bare knuckle. There were no gloves. Gloves that were only used to put on boxing exhibitions to show people how it was done. To win money, to win at a prize fight, you had to do it bare knuckle. And some wrestling maneuvers were allowed. So it looks a little bit more like MMA, mixed martial arts that we would talk about today. We have a good amount of punching and moving around the ring, but where you could flip somebody over your hip or something like that, try to fall on them. These are the kinds of ways it was fought. Rounds did not go for a prescribed period of time. They went when someone went down. So if somebody goes down, the round ends. You have 30 seconds then to come back to scratch. So are you up to scratch? That's where that term comes from. You have 30 seconds to get back to scratch. The fight goes on until one person can't come to scratch anymore. whether he can't make it or whether the people who happen to be in his corner throw in the towel, as it were, as the saying goes, and decide the fight can go on no longer. So at one of these fights, when he's fighting Hammerlane, he's going to break Hammerlane's arm. Then he's going to exploit that for the most part. And after he does so, he's going to be able to defeat Hammerlane. And this is the first time he gains notoriety in the press. People are noticing that you have this great fighter. However, the future for our friend Yankee Sullivan now is not going to be in England. He's actually on the lam. He's an escaped convict. And soon enough, word is beginning to spread that, hey, maybe this Yankee isn't a Yankee after all. Maybe he's escaped from Australia. He could be imprisoned and sent back to Australia. He doesn't want to do so. So what does he do? Excuse me. He heads back to New York City. And what we see in New York City, this is what South Street Seaport looked like at the time. Peck Slip was where most of the ships coming in from Liverpool actually came to. And you see on the top part there, you see there's a ship, and on top of the mast there is a black there's a black dot on the flag. This is known as the Black Circle Line. And this is the line that kind of came and went between Liverpool and New York City. So he's going to arrive back here, and then he's not going to spend much time here. He's going to walk about 10 minutes away to the infamous 5 Points. The infamous 5 Points are right behind where City Hall sits today. Actually, it's in the areas around all the courts of justice. That's where the 5 Points once stood. It's almost ironically fitting that indeed is where the 5 Points were, because it was the most notorious neighborhood in all of New York, where different peoples rubbed shoulders together. It was a place that was known for crime and vice, prostitution, for all kinds of illegal fighting, all kinds of illegal gambling. And this is an area, because it is the poorest part, that the Irish increasingly are start streaming into. Okay, so if you, for example, have seen the movie Gangs of New York, that's set in the 5 Points. And we have the character Daniel Day-Lewis on the right. We have Leonardo DiCaprio on the left. DiCaprio representing the Irish coming in. Daniel Day-Lewis representing what we call the nativists. That is kind of the established Americans who were there before, who began to hate the Irish. So to a certain extent, it's almost like he's thrust into bandit almost once more, that he finds himself, if you will, an outsider in this kind of world that is defined by different sorts of ethnic tensions. In Ireland, it was sectarian tensions. What you're going to find here in New York more than anything else, it's ethnic tensions. But it was a place, too, that's pluralist, just like London. It's a place, too, that's developing and growing by leaps and bounds, because New York at this time is dynamically growing. It's not only tied to Liverpool, but New York is one of those places like Sydney, Australia, that ties a continent to an oceanic system. With the creation of the Erie Canal, New York's hinterland is going to be much of the American Midwest. And New York is going to become an imperial city. That's why New York gets its name, the Empire State, because it's going to be at the center of an empire that now ties that one city into the world and also ties it into the North American continent. New York is going to grow by leaps and bounds. And you're going to need people who are going to do the physical work of making it grow. That's what the Irish are going to do. So even before the famine strikes, and our friend James Yankee Sullivan is going to return in 1841, famine's going to hit in 1845. Even before the famine hits, thousands and thousands of Irish are already streaming in to do the difficult work of making New York the imperial city that it would become. Our friend Sullivan was going to open up a bar that's going to be known as the Sawdust House. Where it's sat is actually right down by a park, the Collect Pond Park that you see here before you. That's more or less where his place once stood. And just across the street from his place is the building we see on the left-hand side that was known as the Tombs Prison. Again, appropriate. He would spend some time in the Tombs Prison. The Sawdust House was a place where all kinds of blood sport went on, where people could engage in bare knuckle boxing, where also there were people who indulged in what we call ratting. That is, you kind of throw a bunch of rats into a small ring, and terriers would kill the rats, and you gamble to see how quickly the terrier could kill all the rats that were there. Cockfighting. These kinds of things are what occurred. Prostitution. All kinds of drinking. And these places became important gambling dens, and they become important areas now where people are going to start promoting prize fighting. And that indeed is one of the things that he's going to do. This is one of the buildings that actually exists in New York today, down by South Street Seaport, just a few blocks away. But you see on the left-hand side, it was one of these sportsmen's halls. This was a place where there was bare knuckle boxing and ratting and cockfighting occurred. And we know it's probably one of the few places still stands that Yankee Sullivan probably had a bout or two, probably putting on exhibitions or just kind of having a little set to within a pub. Because our man, before too long, becomes very famous because of the reputation he enjoys, having beat this great fighter, Hammer Lane, in London. So his reputation precedes him, and people know a great deal about Yankee Sullivan and about his boxing prowess. And soon enough, there's other fighters who want to start taking him on. And he's set up in all of these matches early on. And out of the Sawdust House, he's promoting his own fights. He's kind of setting himself up with some of the best fighters in the area, and he happens to be winning them all. And soon enough, as he's winning all of his fights, more and more people are going to say, well, Yankee Sullivan is a special kind of character now that is, if you will, standing as the champion of the Irish. And this is going to lead to one of the most important fights in the whole 19th century, when he's going to be squaring off against the great Tom Hyer. Now, I mentioned before Gangs of New York. There we have the Daniel Day-Lewis character who plays Bill the Butcher Cutting. In real life, that was Bill the Butcher Poole. He was another one of these guys who was involved in all of this prize fighting at the time. But his best buddy, Daniel Day-Lewis's best buddy, was a fellow by the name of Tom Hyer, who was one of these nativist hardcore guys who hated the Irish, who happened to be streaming in. And he styled himself a great fighter. We see in this image here, we see Tom Hyer on the right-hand side, the taller one. Tom Hyer was big. He was brawny. His father had been a prize fighter before him. He was kind of a physical specimen at the time, and he was younger than our friend James Yankee Sullivan. Well, as the sayings went in any way, is that nobody beats Father Time when it comes to boxing. Older fighters usually struggle against younger ones, and smaller fighters always struggle against bigger ones. So, if you will, James Yankee Sullivan had two strikes against him. They were going to set up this match between, if you will, the Irish and the natives, as they kind of, all of these kind of big major gangs in the areas were going to coalesce for this fight and put their money on their man. And if you see a little close up here, you see something very interesting. James Yankee Sullivan is no longer wearing the stars and stripes. He's got green around him. He's got green around him because he's representing the Irish and he's seen as their champion. And then you have a guy by the name Tom Hyer, who actually is going to be wearing a starry field of blue. So he's, if you will, kind of flying the American colors at the time. And so the two are going to slug it out. But I would say too this fight isn't only about kind of ethnic enmity between the two. This is also about political power in the 5 points. For these people, boxing wasn't a sport or boxing wasn't a pastime. Boxing meant so much more. For those working men who are making cities like New York and tying them into the rest of the world, boxing was a way that you claimed status. Boxing was a way that you made money. Boxing was a way that you claimed a place in this dynamically changing city. And Yankee Sullivan, for the Irish at this moment anyway, was going to be their champion. He's going to take on Hyer, and Hyer is going to beat him. Again, it's hard to beat younger men. It's hard to beat bigger men. He had two things against him. He tried to fight, if you will, craftily, but Tom Hyer just completely overpowered him. And all of his skill and all of his experience was really no avail against Tom Hyer. So he loses, but he doesn't quite yet lose Irish New York. He's still regarded as the champion, but then there's going to be a new upstart Irishman after this bout that's going to challenge him once more for supremacy of the Irish in the 5 points. His name is going to be John Smoke Morrissey. We see him here on the right-hand side. He was known as Old Smoke. He got the nickname Old Smoke because of the kind of the pain that he could endure. One time he was having a bar fight in New York, and there happened to be one of these potbelly stoves there. And his opponent, a fellow by the name of Tom McCann, pushed him into the potbelly stove, and it fell over, and coals were scattered on the ground. And McCann then pinned Morrissey's back to the burning coals. Morrissey got up, someone poured water all over him, and then smoke began to ascend from his back. And that's when he got the nickname Old Smoke. He was tough. He was Irish. He was also born in Ireland, but he grew up in Troy, New York, came down to the city of New York, and he wanted to be kind of what Yankee Sullivan was. He wanted to be the champion of the Irish. Why? Because being the champion of the Irish meant that you ran politically the 5 points. Politics at the time were not practiced like they are today. We think of democracy as this, if you will, consensuous practice that's built upon consensus and is built upon peaceful methods of deliberation, of reasoned dissent and reasoned difference. Back in the 5 points, where people are still trying to figure out how democracy worked and what popular sovereignty actually meant, violence was also part and parcel of it. American democracy was violent in general, but no more so than in the 5 points. As a matter of fact, the faction that could get the toughest people on its side, or what it called its bully boys, was the one that was going to be able to take the day. So livelihoods, lives were at stake with who could have the toughest guys on their side. And Morrissey now wants to take out James Yankee Sullivan. He proposes a fight with Tom Hyer. He doesn't have enough money to take on Hyer. Hyer says, I'll take you on, but you got to raise a lot of money. He can't do that. But he starts insulting Yankee Sullivan. He starts claiming that Yankee Sullivan is over the hill. He starts kind of going into the bar. He's following him around. He's trying to egg him on to get a fight with him, and eventually he will be able to do so. And the two are going to meet in 1853 at a place in upstate New York, about an hour and a half drive from the city, a place called Boston Corner. And they picked this place perfectly because Boston Corner was just over the Berkshires from Massachusetts, but technically it was in the state of Massachusetts. But police officials couldn't actually, they couldn't enforce any crimes in the area. So it was known as this kind of place of horse thieves and crime dens and gambling. And now you're finding all of these prize fighters are coming to this little place in the middle of nowhere because it's a lawless kind of place. And this is where they're going to stage the fight. And they're going to stage it on, it says October 5th. It's going to be October 12th, 1853. Morrissey is going to be fighting against Yankee Sullivan. Thousands of these gangbangers of people like this are going to be descending on this kind of place in the middle of nowhere. And it's going to terrify the locals when they see them. Their bucolic little setting is going to be upset by all of these kind of urban sharps who are going to be descending upon the place. Ultimately, the fight is going to go exactly as you would expect. Morrissey wasn't much of a fighter, but Morrissey could endure punishment. He was able to take it like nobody else. And Sullivan was able to dole it out. And he's going to be much, much more scientific than he had been with Tom Hyer. That Morrissey is a younger man and a bigger man, but he's going to fight this one very differently than he had with Hyer. And more or less, he's winning this bout. And it's only going to be a matter of time till he can take Morrissey out. But he keeps hitting, and Morrissey keeps enduring more and more and more punishment. Ultimately, what's going to happen is that by the end of one of these rounds, okay, Morrissey is going to grab Sullivan and pull the ropes around him and start to almost strangle him. And Sullivan's going to do his best to wriggle out. And then all hell breaks loose. People break into the ring. The fight is more or less kind of over at the time. People start hammering away at Sullivan. Morrissey's hammering away at others. And outside the ring, Sullivan can't get back in after he's tied up and was fighting all these other guys. And then the fight is called for Morrissey because only Morrissey had been able to come to scratch. And it's because Sullivan was stuck outside the ring fighting these other kind of people. Yankee Sullivan was clearly robbed, but it meant the end of his ascendancy in New York City at the time. What's going to happen to John Morrissey? Well, here's a picture of him later on. He's going to go on to found Saratoga Race Course. So Saratoga Racetrack, he's going to be known as a great gambler, and that's going to be how he's going to make so much of his money. He will also go on to be a two-term U.S. congressman. Amazing when you do think about it. What a difference from what he was as Old Smoke. He had been able to clamber his way to the very top of the Tammany Hall political machine. Then he's going to be elected to Congress. What about Sullivan? Well, Sullivan's adventures don't end here. What Sullivan is going to do is that after he has these experiences in New York, he's going to head to greener pastures. He's going to look for another one of these places that's in the process, if you will, of becoming. What are some of these places in America now that are going to through these transition points, just like New York, where opportunity beckons and possibilities abound for those people who can improvise and those people looking for the next great chance? He's going to go out first to California. In the wake of the gold rush, he's going to make his way out to San Francisco, and he's going to open up a bar here. He's going to start promoting fighting. But there's all kinds of difficulties in San Francisco at this time, by and large, because Australians have come over to San Francisco, and the place is flooded with all these ex-convicts from Sydney who hope to make good also on the gold rush. And there's no order. It's all chaos. And what's going to happen is in the early 1850s, a vigilance committee is going to arise to push out all these undesirables. When this happened, Yankee Sullivan is going to go up to the hills. He's going to go up to the hills of the Sierra Nevadas, where there happen to be people are out there in gold fields. He's going to be putting on boxing exhibitions in some of these camps, anywhere where people are panning for gold. He's going to be making a little money, doing a little sparring in and of himself. But then eventually he's going to leave California for a bit and head to, of all places, Hawaii. He's going to go to Honolulu. Why is he going to go to Honolulu? Well, Honolulu is another one of these places that's becoming. Hawaii is an independent kingdom at the time, but it's an independent kingdom that's being vied over by the British, the Americans, and the French. Who's going to have supremacy? Who's going to be able to, if you will, take advantage of what these riches that Hawaii would potentially portend? Who can do that? And that's a question right now the people who are running Hawaii, Kingdom of Hawaii, are trying to manage. They're trying to see what particular power they're going to ultimately be allied with. There's another reason why he goes to Hawaii. It had become the center, if you will, of global whaling. That the Bay of Islands becomes less and less attractive, and more ships, particularly American ships, are stopping in Hawaii as more and more of them are going into the Pacific. So it becomes a center of the global whaling trade. It also is going to be a connection point between the west coast of the United States and to Asia. That's another role that Hawaii is going to play. So it's another one of these connection nodes or zones that he had been attracted to before. But now he's coming in as a bit of a celebrity. What's going to happen here is that he's going to actually, before he comes here, he's going to get married to a woman. And the woman's going to give birth to a daughter while he's in Hawaii. He also is going to befriend King Kamehameha IV. When King Kamehameha was Crown Prince of Hawaii, he had actually come out to New York. He had visited many parts of the world that Yankee Sullivan had moved through, and he knows all about him. And as stories go, anyway, Yankee Sullivan is giving boxing lessons to King Kamehameha IV, and they're palling around and drinking with each other. It leads some people to write and say, I don't know what King Kamehameha is doing here, but he's spending too much time with that Sullivan character. Okay, so Sullivan then is kind of running afoul of some authorities that happen to be here. They claim that he beat somebody up, and he's got to make his way out of Hawaii, and he decides to head back to San Francisco once more. In San Francisco now, he's going to run a bar. He's going to be putting on boxing exhibitions, the things that he knows well. He's more or less going to try to recreate exactly the kinds of things that he had done in New York City earlier. And one of the things that he's going to be involved in here is also creating politics in San Francisco, doing exactly what he did in the 5 Points when he was trying to create with his very hands Tammany Hall. Actually, he's going to be head of a faction known as the Tammany Democrats that happened to be out in San Francisco. San Francisco was more or less a colony of New York. As more and more New Yorkers, many of them prize fighters like Yankee Sullivan, but also the sons of wealthy New Yorkers, are going to come here and try to make San Francisco theirs. And nearly all of the gold that's going to be kind of mined here in California is going to go through San Francisco, is going to go down to the Isthmus of Panama, make its way to another ship, thence up to the banks in New York City. So this too is a hyper-connected place. Ships are going to Honolulu. Ships are going via the Isthmus to New York City. This place is connected as any other, and this looks like the next future place of all kinds of settlement. And it's also the place where politics needs to be established. And Yankee Sullivan is becoming a bully boy for the Tammany Democrats in San Francisco. So he's doing work that he's well accustomed to. He's doing work that he is really in many ways made for. This is the perfect place for a guy like him, a guy who can improvise, a guy who can think on the fly, a guy who can think about the next opportunity. As I put it to you earlier, he is ideally suited, as are all prize fighters in this day, and this place is filled with them, for places that are becoming. And San Francisco happened to be the next great place becoming. So he's found himself a home here for a period of time anyway. But that story's not going to last too long. Why not? Well, I mentioned before the Vigilance Committee that was kind of, if you will, getting rid of all the Australians. A new Vigilance Committee arises in 1856, and this Vigilance Committee's job is quite simple. It's to get rid of all these New Yorkers, many of them Irish New Yorkers, like James Yankee Sullivan, who are, as they put it, corrupting good California politics at the time. And so the Vigilance Committee turns itself into kind of an army of vigilantes trying to get rid of all of these men who are corrupting politics at the day. Ultimately, a number of people are going to be hanged, okay, including the guy that Yankee Sullivan is working for, a fellow by the name of James Casey, who is running for elective office, another one of these New Yorkers coming over, who's the head, who's one of the heads of the Tammany Democrats at the time. He's going to be hanged, again, with another Catholic at the time who's going to be hanged. So this Vigilance Committee is anti-New York, anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, trying to do away with all what they regard as the corrupting influences that are going to change San Francisco into something they don't want to be part of. And Yankee Sullivan is one of them. So Yankee Sullivan is going to be rounded up along with a bunch of these other characters, and is going to be put in prison in this building we see right here, outside of which these two men are going to be hanged. While this is happening, he happens to be in a jail cell that's created in this building, okay? And he's hearing about what's going on to his friend James Casey, and he knows that other people he knows have also been rounded up and imprisoned. Numbers are going to be warned out. They're just going to basically tell them, you know, you're exiled. You're going to have to leave here, or you're going to end up like Casey. Sullivan, however, is in the jail cell when all this is going on. Sullivan's not going to have the opportunity to actually be warned out, because one night in 1856, one morning in 1856, the jailer comes in and notices that Yankee Sullivan happens to be dead. Now, there's lots of controversy about how he died. There's lots of different stories. Authorities are going to claim that Yankee Sullivan killed himself. They're going to claim, and you see this in this woodcut right here, that he had cut his artery right by his elbow and had bled to death. It's not really an ideal or easy way to kind of to off oneself at the time. They said he was going to be so terrified that he was going to be killed that he didn't know what to do. I wonder because Yankee Sullivan is the guy who's used to being in prisons. He had been in all those prisons in Australia. He had been in Newgate prison in London. He had been in the Tombs prison in New York. He'd even spent a spell in Sing Sing prison in New York. This is a guy who knows prisons and certainly isn't afraid of him. Okay? Others are going to claim that he was beaten to death, that authorities are going to say that they just made up the suicide sort of thing. And there's probably some truth to this. Maybe he was beaten to death. I wonder, though, if possibly he was suffering from what we call CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, okay, that lots of fighters struggle with today. People who have become, if you will, the derisive term used to be punch drunk. People who were becoming too punchy from all the times they had been hit in the head. We know for a fact that his actions had become more sporadic over a period of time. And what you find, unfortunately, is those prize fighters that suffer from CTE, they'll usually turn to the bottle. And that's one of the things that Yankee Sullivan was doing. He was drinking more than ever. And this was a hard drinking world. But a good number of fighters actually end up killing themselves also. And that maybe potentially this was the lot of James Yankee Sullivan. So in 1856, James Yankee Sullivan is no more. The Catholic Church thought that this was kind of an issue of him being beaten to death, as it puts on his tombstone, okay, that he was assassinated at the hands of the Vigilance Committee. And you can go see his grave today. It's in the Mission Dolores Cemetery in San Francisco, the oldest Catholic cemetery there. And there you can find the gravestone of James Yankee Sullivan. And it says something else interesting. You can't really read it there on the bottom of the tombstone, but it more or less kind of asks God's mercy for James Sullivan and for his family. But it also asks that God's mercy be turned to vengeance against his enemies. And if there's any kind of fitting little statement about James Yankee Sullivan, you have it right there. So he dies this way, but he dies in one of these places that was becoming. Again, like all these other places we've talked about before. What does this mean? This whole story mean for us? Is this just a story of kind of a prize fighter who's going to end his life, in a jail cell in San Francisco? I think actually it tells us a great bit more. If you follow his story from the place he was born, to the London that he was going to go to the Australia that he was going to help build, to the New Zealand he was going to escape away from on a whaler, to the Liverpool that he was going to fight out of, to the New York he was going to come back and dominate the politics of, and to the San Francisco that he was also going to define early on. If you follow him around to all of these places, you find that one place after another he's attracted to are those places that are in key transition moments as they are becoming chief connection points to the rest of the world. It's no mistake he's here. These are, if you will, the kind of forgotten founders, I think, that had kind of more or less kind of carved our world out. They did it physically with their hands. So many of them were doing it kind of lifting load by load, digging kind of inch by inch, kind of breaking up piece of rock after piece of rock. He happened to be doing it largely with his fists. But just as I said before, what he did wasn't a pastime. What he did was actually vital to kind of how people like him defined themselves in this hyper-competitive world that the modern world had become. He was ideally suited to his times. It's also fitting that he died after his time in San Francisco, because he died more or less when that kind of period of time, that window that allowed him to thrive, when men like him kind of were at the front end of the stage, where that window was beginning to close. So Yankee Sullivan isn't just the story of one character who happened to be an amazing prize fighter and the first great American prize fighter. It is a story ultimately about us, about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how our world came to be. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy this discussion of Yankee Sullivan as a founding father and a world maker. Be well.
Whoop, there I am. Well, thank you so much for coming today, and I hope you found that fascinating as I did. And again, Dr. Griffin said that he will answer all the questions through email. So I look forward to you writing questions out and sending them. And we'll see you at our next lecture.